I'm Catherine.
I'm Teresa.
And we are the co-authors of the book, Pass the Baton, Empowering All Music Students.
Our goal is to share stories of educators who are passing the baton and empowering their music students. We want to help teachers create music lessons that transform students from passive consumers to vibrant creatives. All right, welcome everybody. Hello, it's so good to see you today. We are joined today by Robby Burns. I'm so excited to have Robby joining us. I had the pleasure of meeting Robby about a year ago when I was a guest on his podcast. So we're kind of coming full circle here. So thanks for being here, Robby.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So Robby, we wonder if you could introduce yourself a little bit. Tell us about your background, your teaching role.
Sure. Yeah. So I'll try not to be too long on the background. I guess we can work backwards as if anything is interesting to you. But the general story is that I am a middle school band and general music teacher in Ellicott City, Maryland, in a district. We do our districts by county. So I teach in Howard County, Maryland. And at Ellicott Mills, there are, I'm one of two band teachers. We each teach general music a little bit and also two bands each. And then we have 3 orchestras and 4 choirs and a number of extracurricular kind of jazz and symphony orchestra and percussion ensemble related things. So it's a busy and fun time. I am also, I direct our district's middle school now honor band, and I have a pretty active private teaching studio. I teach percussion, and I'm a little bit active still as a freelance percussionist, but most of my percussion energy is getting thrown into teaching about 15 to 20 private students here in my home studio. And then I've got all the, I guess I'm going to have an opportunity to like shamelessly plug some stuff later, but I've got some online stuff too. I've got my podcast, Music Ed Tech Talk, which is also a blog, and just some like online digital conference presenting and resource creating that I'm doing for teachers. And
that's awesome.
That's the short version. Yeah.
No, that's great. So one of the reasons that we wanted to talk to you today was a project that I've heard you talk about on your podcast and kind of other little social media things having to do with a work by Alex Shapiro, putting the E in Ensemble. Can you tell us what that is and what in the world you did?
Sure. So I'll say, like, at the beginning of this past school year, which was, we came into the school year in Howard County knowing that we were going to be fully virtual to begin the year. Mm-hmm. And I knew that some things I wanted to try to see, like, how can I actually give my students what they're used to doing and experiencing as best I can, but within the limitations of the virtual model. And then I was at the same time thinking, like, what are ways that I can exercise the strengths of this model and try different things that maybe I did not want to do or think were valuable or did not have the impetus to do, but thought were valuable due to the regular annual stresses and pressures of, like, all the other kinds of goals you have as a performing arts teacher. So, in my classes this year, I tried to keep my band students playing as much as possible. We did things that were rehearsal light. We did playing warm-ups. I made a lot of, exercise related, like, practice resources for them to play to, playing to professional recording practice tracks, lots of playing, lots of, feedback, lots of that stuff. But I also thought to myself, there are tools out there and methods of music making that are just much more, conducive to this kind of virtual model. And one of those things is composing music. And I don't know if this year was my first year ever doing a composition project of any size, but it was certainly the first year that I did something that, like, had a kind of like a multi-week with, like, it was broken down into smaller, more bite-sized assessments that sort of were a sequence to a bigger goal. And it's certainly the first time that I've had as many, like, restrictions on my students to help them to sort of get their footing and be successful with what is, composing is just such an open thing. And especially because you're in this case, you're teaching the tools, not just the skill itself. So it's like learning how to write write interesting melodic content for your instrument also introduces, like, how do I actually, like, where are the buttons in note flight? what are like, the kinds of things that I have to be like, what is my instrument's transposition? Like a lot of them kind of have like a fundamental intuition about that, but not a lot of them like it's concrete enough where they like understood like what key they had to choose and how to change, like go between concert and transposed pitch in the score. So anyway, those are just something. I'm not actually telling you what the project is. Let me actually tell you what the project is. So putting the E and Ensemble is a curriculum designed by Alex Shapiro, who is an amazing composer. And the project is somewhat of a collaboration with some other composers for young band. There's actually like different sort of pathways that on her website you can go depending on the level or the age of your ensemble. I actually had heard about this project from another podcast guest on my show, Dr. Christopher Ciccone, who teaches at Towson University in Maryland. And he had done this virtually with his band students. And so I just went with like the high school college. I think you can be any age band and do any one of these versions. Like Brian Ballmay just has like sort of an adaptation of the curriculum that's all detailed on her website. But the short version is she knew that, when this school year started, that students were going to need to be creative in this way. She wants to always at every turn be inspiring young people to be creative. So she put together this project, which my sort of, I'll give you like the zoomed out version of it, like the top, and if you want details, I can tell you how I implemented it, which was actually quite different than what her curriculum recommends, but it was the general same idea. So you start by the students compose short melodic material, and you could easily do it by pencil and paper, but we had note flight. So we did note flight assignments where they were writing melodies that were not any longer than 8 measures. And then I actually had each of them do an ostinato pattern as well to get things that were more repetitive and rhythmic. And then what they do is in a separate part of this project, they record themselves in a digital audio workstation, recording their melodic content. So they have to do it, we used Soundtrap, and they record to a click track so that all of the examples, the final examples, are the same tempo as one another. Because then what they do is they export the recording of themselves to an MP3 and then share it with me so that I can take all of them in the entire class and then give it back to them in a folder where they have access to every student's recorded thing. And then the final project is in a fresh new Soundtrap project, you take all these little components, musical components that were recorded and composed by your classmates, and then you organize and arrange them, you edit them, you splice them, you auto-tune them, you add beats if you want. Alex Shapiro provides this ethereal sort of drone sound that is like the base that you can. So I brought that drone into the template of the project and told them you can use it if you want, it's recommended. And then, and that drone sort of encourages them to do kind of like rhythmically very free sort of kinds of ideas, but some students opted instead to use like a drum loop in the Soundtrap library to create more of like something that had a little bit more rhythm. And then they mix up, mash up, arrange these into the format of about a 2-minute long project, and then they share them back to me, and they're awesome. I had such a fun time, and they all sounded great.
So you said that you did things a little bit differently than Alex Shapiro had intended. How so?
So she's really smart. So some of the things that in her curriculum I ignored, I'm going to do next year. I had been thinking about this project all year long, and it just like I knew as the year progressed, it became clearer and clearer that it was just going to fit best into my goals, like kind of towards the tail end of the school year. So I just knew that for me, with the time I had left in the school year, by the time I got around to this project, that I was going to be able to execute it better if I left out some of the details. Mm-hmm. Some of the details that she recommends that I think are really good are like recommends that the director splits the class into smaller groups. Mm. And then the smaller groups this can sort of like add some clarity and structure to the project, which is good for young people. But also what it more importantly does is then that group is only working with the sounds of their group. So like I found that like a couple of we call them loops, because when they're metrically recorded correctly, you can use the little loop tool in Soundtrap and just drag. You can have a 1 measure flute thing, just continue on and on and on. When you are doing this, let me catch my thought here. When you're doing this, some of the like really good ones just get overused. So like almost every other student used this one really good oboe melody that was super catchy. And then like there was a couple of flute patterns that I just heard get used. You know, there was one person who had a little like one measure glockenspiel ostinato, and it was like you could hear it in every single, almost what felt like every single project. Whereas if I said like these 5 or 6 students get these 6 to 12 audio samples, I feel like, you know, we know this as musicians, like when you limit yourself in a way, it generally fosters some kind of creativity. Mm-hmm. So I think that the end results would have been way more diverse had I structured it this way.
Yeah, that makes sense. And you're right. Like there's a lot of creativity that can come from having those limitations. And I think sometimes we're too quick to just say, make something, create something, you know, and we don't give any limitations. And that can be hard for the students.
It's hard. You have to do it with the composing, especially because they don't know what necessarily makes a good melody. So you have to coach them. And you can say things like, okay, if it's in the key of concert B flat, the first and the last note have to be a concert B flat. But the second you start doing that, you realize how arbitrary those rules are, because it's like, well, not all music in the key of B flat starts or even ends on the note B flat. And all of your rules make no sense. But what is happening is you're sort of giving them as many of the common characteristics of a thing so that they can learn to appreciate that thing when maybe they witness it outside of context, to where it doesn't have all of the features and parameters that you've set out for them.
Right.
So what were the kids' response to this project? What did you see in them from this?
Yeah, so it was a mix. I mean, I think sometimes like the idea of composing for like band or orchestra or choir students is like romanticized. Like not everyone loves it, but it was a part of their creativity that was previously untapped. So what I got to see was a lot of them really just like took to it. And you can see, you know, we always can tell what's going on with their ears and their minds by like how they play for us in class. But you get a different angle and perspective on what they hear in their inner ear when they start giving you stuff. Like if it's formless, that might be a student who doesn't like really understand musical form on the same level, even though they've only ever been like taught it through this act of like playing concert band pieces. And that does have an effect on a student's musicianship. Like that might be the kind of student who doesn't understand that the climactic moment of the piece is like the return of the theme. And then you conversely, you see students who you can hear all sorts of these crazy ideas that actually were in their head floating around in there all along, but that you never gave them the platform or the tools or even just like the power of suggestion is huge. Like you never even suggested to them, why don't you just like make that thing that's in your head? And this happened in numerous cases. One of our flute players would always just finish each step of this process early. So she finishes her 8-measure flute melody like within 15 minutes, and it's like really actually very good. And so I'm like, all right, well, what can you make it 16 measures? And she's like, well, why 16? And then we're talking a little bit about that. And then she takes just a few more minutes to make it good. And then I said, okay, well, why don't you just like tell me like what this sounds like a lot of things we played in band. What is the tuba doing? And then she kind of sings me, you know, what could be a tuba part. And I said, great, write it. Here's how you add the tuba. And then, you know, she's doing like 2 or 3 voices. So, you know, you can differentiate for the different kids and sort of like, as someone an educator I respect, Ethan Hines, says, like, you can have like low floors and high ceilings for these kinds of creative projects. He says that. I think he would credit someone else for saying that, but I know that he says that saying a lot. And, you know, you just like have room for them to do more with it, but at a basic level, everyone is being creative with like the easiest possible, you know, tools available.
That's really cool. So you kind of mentioned this a little bit. Do you think you'll do it again next year when it's not a pandemic and you hopefully are in the classroom and all of that?
Yeah, I mean, on one hand, I think I have to, because the excuse prior to this year was that like I didn't have the infrastructure set up to support this. And now I have all these like templates and instructions. And so on one level, it would seem for that is not a very inspiring reason to do it again, but that it seems like I have no excuse not to. The more important reason is that this is actually, to me, I think like in talking with Alex, you know, when she was on my show, I think it was clear to me like how important to the whole of someone's musicianship this act of writing is. Like, it's not like, this is actually something that really can serve your interests if you're in an environment where you're teaching performing arts, because these kids, once they're learning how a piece of music is put together, they're becoming like more aware of all the things you want them to be aware of in a band rehearsal. Like, how does my part fit into what this other instrument is doing? Is this note that I'm playing in tune with another note? Like, you're thinking much more like forest and less trees but also understanding the details at a higher level, because you've like, edited and I mean, some of these kids will like in soundtrack, like take one note that they like from one sample and then like just take that one note and like make a cool rhythm. Like, they get super surgical and detailed with it. So knowing that process and that craft, really, I think they bring it back into the band room, or at least I hope. I haven't seen them in person yet, but that's the idea.
Yeah. And I think that's such a good point that, you're using this to enhance what they're doing. You're enhancing their musicianship, right? It's not like you're taking away from the performing aspect of things. You're helping to build that. And I think we forget that sometimes. So how would you do anything differently in person, or you haven't gotten that far yet? That's a fair answer too.
Yeah. I just need to figure out when is the time. Cause I know like,
yeah,
I was tethered to a computer all school year long. So when it's like an appendage to yourself, the idea of like, hey, you're already looking at my screen, so let me now give you some instructions about a project. It seems like this is one of the things I want to like really think about more broadly going into next school year, is like, how does this idea of the computer be an extension of all of my teaching? How does that enter back into like traditional methods of teaching? Because there's so much cool stuff I did this year that I think would enhance the rehearsal if they were seeing a lot of the same things visually and hearing a lot of the things that I would demonstrate for them through computer software. But I know that it's going to take a solid week of like dedicating some band rehearsal time to how to set up the project and these kinds of things.
Yeah, that's just the reality of the situation, right? Is that you're going to have to take the time to set it up, but hopefully the benefits are great enough that it's worth it.
That's the hope.
Yeah.
So what advice would you give another teacher if they wanted to incorporate a project like this?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's a good question. I think that like I would like to think that my flexibility in approaching it in my own way was one of the reasons I was able to approach something, because the document it's pretty lengthy. It's a lot. Like, you can do it over a longer period of time, broken down into smaller, bits and pieces. And if you're the kind of person who has the mind where you really like to have a plan laid out for you in those steps, it's there for you if you do put in the E and Ensemble. But I would recommend just sort of having the softness to be willing to like, just like Alex herself said, when I told her I didn't really do it your way, she was like, that's great. You should like, what works for your students and for you is like the whole point of both the point of the project, but also like you have to, if you're going to ever get this in front of your students. So I guess I would just recommend be flexible. Like, if all you do is just like put some notes in note flight, like that's more composing maybe than you did the last school year. So baby steps, and then just, be flexible, be adaptive to your students, and have them in mind.
Well, and that's what you're trying to teach them too, right? You're trying to teach the students to be flexible and adaptable and to have that creativity. So by you modeling that in the process, I think it's a win.
Yeah. And I think it's something that you've said that I know I do too, is like, no one gets a home run the first time they try a project, especially a big project, right? Like, it's going to take it. I think if we talk to you in 3 years, you would have totally different way of how you've incorporated this and done things, right? Because it's just every year we always kind of build off what we've tried and what we've done. And so, like you've said, this is something that can grow. And next year you've already got ideas that you might want to try and on top. So, that's just kind of how we all do things. And
yeah, sometimes like once they get practiced and tested, they get so much better,
sure,
through that craft. Like, I was definitely not competent at anything I was doing as a first year teacher. I mean, some things, but like my band rehearsal skills are so much better now. It would make sense that the composing thing would get sharper too as time goes.
Yeah.
And you have to adapt to the kids in front of you. right? The kids you have in front of you next year won't be the same ones you had this year, even if they have the same name, same bodies. They've grown as humans as well. So you have to adapt to whatever you're going to see. Which I'm sure, like you mentioned, the flute player who wrote tuba parts. That's what you do.
Yeah, you have to just try to engage them. Yeah, again, it's like the low floor and the high ceiling thing, and that's tough to do in the large sizes that these performing arts classes sometimes are. And we're so used to like hearing them all play, but like having the ear training to be able to then like hear where are the students who need me to help, with them now. And that's happening like just through like pure musicianship and training that, performing arts teachers go through. But with the composing, it'll be interesting to see how able I am to juggle, especially with like a real other things going on in the class, not just like being in front of a computer in a virtual environment. Like how will I give that level of detail of instruction? I'm not really sure yet.
Yeah. But I mean, I'm even picturing just like based on like projects I had done when we were in person prior to pandemic, just like how fun it is when you see 40 kids scattered around the room with working on their devices and being able to walk up to them and just be like, what are you doing? And to say to a person right there in front of you, tell me about this. And to be able to have that conversation where I'm sure online that was challenging.
Yeah. Well, I'm like, I should be clear. We did end our year hybrid, but the teaching of the in-person students was not like dramatically altered. It was still very much like we had to sort of like plan around teaching virtually, and then some of them were in the room. Yeah. But what I'm saying is there was a little bit of that interaction. Like flute student previously mentioned, it was actually an in-person student. So that's
good. Yeah. so you knew how valuable that is then. That's awesome. Right.
Some of that feedback was able to be delivered in the online model though. And yeah, it's fun. You get to ask kids like, why did you do that? Like you never get to, you can ask them like, why did you think the composer did this? But it's totally different to ask them, why did you do, like, did you mean to have these two instruments like a half step apart? I don't know. I was just experimenting. It's like, okay, so like, that's cool. That's part of this process. When you're done the project, like, does that have an intent behind it that you think will communicate an idea? Because you can get to that level. And I think the goal of the pandemic year and Alex, her vision is like just anywhere doing any of this is so much better than doing none of it. Yeah. But for me, I got a little excited by the process. Some of the kids were ready to go to that level. They're like, okay, I'm done. They wanted to kind of just be done once they met the requirements. And I said, okay, but like, what actually are you communicating to your listener? Like, why did you make the choices that you made?
And being middle school kids, some of them probably just stared at you. And then
I don't know.
That's really fun. Well, we'll make sure that we put a link to putting the E and Ensemble just so that people can access it if they wanted to. But it sounds like even just the composition thing, like you don't need some big massive project to dip your toe into it.
No.
Right? Paper, pencil, note flight, there's so many different things out there that can have a similar effect. And I think it's important to remember.
Yeah, totally. And with these tools, it's easier than ever.
Yeah. Well, and especially since we just did have a year and a half tethered to devices, we know how to use them now. Right. We don't still need to have it attached to us at all time, but we know how to use it and we know how to incorporate those things. So
yeah.
Cool. All right. So if somebody wants to connect with you and learn more about all the cool stuff you're doing, what should they do?
Okay. So I do some social media. So I'm like, I'm all the places. I'm a tech nerd. So I like try the things. If you want, like, probably like the most of my social media output is happening on Twitter. But I'm, Facebook, Instagram, I have like a Pinterest page and a Twitch and a YouTube. YouTube is probably like second most content is going there. And then Twitch, I stream maybe at least once a month. It's like a perk for my Patreon subscribers. So I have to do it now, but so I'm, just like doing the kinds of things that are, sort of tech, music, and education adjacent, sometimes more one of those three things than the others, but often kind of like the intersections between them. So that's kind of what I'm writing about on Twitter. But then I also have a blog and a podcast called Music Ed Tech Talk. And anyone who's hearing me say this, I would love it if you subscribed to those things. The podcast is in every podcast app. You can get to both places at musicedtechtalk.com. And you can subscribe to the blog, like if you do blog subscribing, or you can just get them emailed to you. There's like a newsletter that comes out every Friday. I've got a book. I should mention that, right?
Sure.
Yeah. So it's called Digital Organization Tips for Music Teachers. And it is purely like the teacher facing sort of logistic side of my technological workflow. Things that, are sometimes, there's things in the book like how to manage your sheet music, but it's largely a book that is about organizing sort of these extra musical categories and getting them out of the way of the actual musicianship and teaching. That's really like why we do what we do. So it's addresses things like email and document management and organization structures. And even there's like some fun automation, like how to make like files automatically go around to the folders you want them to without you lifting a finger, like fun things.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's sort of, that's happening there. But the blog and the podcast are where the most of my, freshest ideas are happening. And they're also the freest of my ideas as well. So.
Always fun. We'll be sure to put links to those as well. And tell us, Sam, what was the title of your book? Did you say that already? Digital
Organization Tips for Music Teachers, which is a mouthful, but if you can remember it, just add .com to the end and it'll take you to a little landing page.
Perfect. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for talking to us today and sharing about your projects.
Thanks for having me.
This is part 2 of a 3-part series on creativity through music composition. Please join us next time for part 3 with Pass the Baton Book's own Teresa Hoover.
Thanks for joining us. Make sure you subscribe below.
And follow us on social media. I'm at Musical Teresa.
I'm Singing Finch 1.
And you can follow the hashtag Pass the Baton Book.